click my little thing properly here. Oops. Okay. Welcome to Evolution Hour. We're back home, able to put up all of our razzle-dazzle stuff. TortuganWordPress.com. And let me then also put up our patrons, without whom it would be bloody hell more difficult to do what it is we do every week. Voila. Thank you to all of our colleagues, researchers, assistant researchers, friends, and assorted people who have helped over the years as legacy patrons. We literally cannot do it without you. Okay, now let's clickety-clack and somebody's on Cano. Hello, Lamont. As we had a truncated show last week because we were over in Seattle celebrating my great-grandniece's 3rd birthday. And a long story as to why I was officially dubbed Captain Napkin. Don't ask. Anyway, we're proceeding with Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air, Jonathan Sarfati's of the Creationist book, which the text seems backwards as I'm putting it to the camera. I hope it looks okay from your end. We don't know. And then a part 2, we'll be having some stuff from Philip Bell from creation.com going on about spider webs. And both of the things, the introductory chapters to Sarfati and Tay's book and also the Philip Bell's piece, are ones that are scavenging in their own little way off of intelligent design and non-young earth creationist apologetics at tactical points. Anyway, we'll be getting to all of that. So we're dealing with the opening chapter, which is basically a philosophical diatribe repeating all of the tropes of young earth creationism, why the earth has to be young, why all the evidence is for that. Official, the bird is dead and the X is here, at least on my phone app. Yes, the Twitter is now called X, according to Musk. I don't care what it's called. He could call it Aardvark for all I care. It doesn't really matter. It's still a useful platform for my needs. And by the way, I am not paying for all the special razzle-dazzle features. So long as it's still a free platform where I can communicate back and forth and find connections with the various people that I follow in the sciences and in our various groups of people who criticize creationism and the like, it's not a big deal for me. So I continue with it. So anyway, I was intrigued with some of the really big tropes that Sarfati was presenting in here. Science was founded by Christians and works because God exists. And that, of course, morality also only comes from God. So he's got a 2009 article that Sarfati had written on this that I'll be putting a link to that riffs off of non-young earth creationist Rodney Stark's Glee Club view of Christianity. And he's been banging this drum for years and years and years and years and years. And that another of his footnotes refers to miracles are fine in science. It's not a problem in Sarfati's view, even though the posting that he put up in 2006 that I'll be putting a link to was really relating to people talking about the virgin birth and resurrection as miracles, not that God was miraculously finagling stuff in the creation aspect. Part of that 2006 post is fielding another non-young earth creationist, C.S. Lewis. So there's an extent to which the apologetic arguments that are being presented in young earth creationism are perfectly consistent with the apologetics that's being presented in the larger mere Christianity point of view that C.S. Lewis would have, and for that matter, Rodney Stark. And along the way, Sarfati is going on criticizing Scientific American for to Sarfati, the false impression that to accept a scientific model that allows miracles is kind of a science stopper. And needless to say, that can be objectively measured insofar as we can see how much of science is being done by the young Earth creationists. Sarfati also is riffing, of course, off of the operational science versus origin science, which is a dichotomy that started from the intelligent design movement in the pandas and people era and has been entrenched as the model that they all go by. I've written on the subject. Jackson Wheat's done material on the subject. There's been a whole slew of people who have investigated the impropriety of trying to make this observational science thing. We mentioned a bit of it in The Rocks Were There, in fact. But what intrigued me in this setup for what is supposed to be a book about dinosaurs and therefore presumably science point of view, and of course the reason why they're going on about dinosaurs is because they're so bloody popular, so they really need to hijack them from their evolutionary context in order to keep kids from being led astray. This is another common trope that pops up in creationist apologetics. Intelligent designers don't care about that because dinosaurs don't bother them and they don't write much about it and don't think much about it. But what intrigued me was right towards the tail end of this chapter was a paragraph that struck me for how it was worded and how it was. What? And he goes on, there is enough evidence to have a good idea of the body shape at least. We have dinosaur bones. And a little later on, we even have some skin or other soft tissue. We have three-dimensional preservation of the body shape. We can see the enormous variety in these magnificent creatures. And he's referring to the future chapters where he's going to be going on and on and on about this. We also know from the Bible that God created all of them to be plant eaters, but some became meat eaters after the fall and became the flood. Well, those are two very different we's, because the we who are doing the science work, none of them are creationists. Not a one. None of the paleontology on the detail work of digging up bones and working out three-dimensional representations and finding the detail work of skin elements or any other aspect, none of it is being done by creationists, although you do have hangers-on like Armitage and others who are doing sort of pseudoscience material from the corners on this. But all the primary work is being done by non-creationists. They are showing by their feet not on the ground, boots not on the ground, that creationism is indeed a showstopper. As for carnivory, Sarfati is being disingenuous here. Goes with the territory. Because it's actually, there's been an evolution, an ongoing evolution, which we're going to be discussing in Volume 2 of The Rocks Were There in much more detail. An ongoing evolution of creationism as to when carnivory came in on the scene. And old style creationists, and to some extent Ken Ham still reflects this, go after the flood as the demarcation zone. But it's now become painfully obvious from the paleontology that we stuff. So did God change the teeth after the fall, or did the plant-eating velociraptors always have those sharp teeth? Oh, Lamont, it's been a trope going back all the way to Dwayne Gish, and Ken Ham certainly has repeated it. It's ubiquitous that you can't tell a damn thing supposedly about what an animal eats based on tooth shape and tooth details. That's bullshit, but it's a trope. And they'll point out, for example, some of the fangs on the front of deer that are herbivorous, but those are used as display things and fighting and to show other factors. But teeth that eat meat have serrations and they have curvatures and details that are very characteristic of that. Just as molars for grinding up plant material are very distinctive, and you find those not in the same modality when you're talking about predators. Something about pandas and bamboo. Ah, yes, indeed. Oh, we'll have some sections on koalas and the eucalyptus leaves and some of the other funky material about how specialized diets a lot of critters are, but in the new book, but that's another matter. Anyway, the thing about the carnivory thing is that there's been an evolution in various subsections of creationism that is admitting that apparently carnivory is existing prior to the flood. And Sarfati kind of dangles bits and pieces of it. We will be discussing various examples of this, of which this newer book is just the most recent example where he's fixed himself. And particularly ironic because Gillis, who represents CMI at that little talk, I'll be putting a link in to it. It'll be in the main book, the discussion of the source citation. There'll be a little bit more on the notes, but I'll give you a little preface of it. Gillis, that was having that talk over in Idaho, that is the reason why I have this book, apparently doesn't read their own material because he was still stuck with the carnivory after the flood model, even though the book that was on sale that was being pushed by CMI was moving the goalposts back. Yipes. Don't they follow too much detail on this stuff. Now, the other little section is a piece from Philip Bell. Bell is going to be coming up in some amusing sections in the new book because he's been pushing the idea that dinosaurs are depicted in medieval tombs, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. He's oh wow, carnivore is a pre-flood is a pretty big concession. Yeah, indeed. It's not a trivial one at all because back in the Duane Gish era, the idea of pre-flood carnivory was just anathema. So there has been a gradual evolution. Sometimes they just drop the subject. So they'll some of the posts at ICR and AIG will allude to critters being carnivores, and they don't make a point of saying, well, by the way, our theology was not saying this up until fairly recently, you know. So there's a great deal of tidying up, rearranging the deck chairs so it doesn't look like the ship is sinking. Anyway, Bell did a post last year on Dance of the Web Weavers on spider webs, and he riffs off only one technical paper, which is this Conyer et al. 2021 that Corver. That fortunately is open access, so I'll be able to put the thing up to it. And it didn't discuss any evolutionary issues. It was a purely technical argument about the dynamics of spider web stuff. But that's probably why Bell was so happy to waive it, because it didn't have any shoes to drop relating to evolution. Bell then claimed that, quote, evolutionists have tried speculating about the origins of web building behavior and silk production, but none of their attempts are remotely credible or accepted by their peers, unquote. Did he cite a technical paper on this? No. It was Eric Castle's Intelligent Design book from the Discovery Institute, and also young Earth creationist Hank Hanegraaff's stuff has extolled it too. So this one has been circulating in that bit. I do not have access to the book itself, but I'll be putting up Hanegraaff's website talking about all of this so that you can get a little bit of an idea about what the book's about. Having no access to it, I don't know what evidence Casal offered, but there's certainly enough science material out there to suggest that he might not be getting the facts straight. Naturally, we'll want you to take a look at the data. So there's a 2008 paper by Selden, which is on fossils and the origin of spider spinnerets. And there's a 2016 paper by Garwood, which is about a almost spider fossil, one of those little transitionals. Fossil Genie is always out there helping us. And then Wang 2018, which is a draft text on a new fossil spider relatives and their extending record back a bit farther. The paper itself has been published, but this was the draft version that I'm posting to, which should be fairly close to what was in the finished text. On the genetic side, there's also a hell of a lot of work about spiders, none of it done by antievolutionists. 2012 paper by Starrett, which is on the genetic end of it, noting, quote, mesothelials and the megalomorphs produce general-purpose fibers and apply silk in a sheet-like manner to a burrow or other substrate, which is believed to be the most similar to silk used in the common ancestor of extant spiders that lived over 380 million years ago, unquote. And most recently, brand new paper from this year Franzen on insect and spider silk, the hidden genetic diversity in that, which is looking at the deeper structure leading to convergence of silk's operations in widely divergent lineages. So what you can do is compare Bell's little teeny piece with the material that's available in those technical papers, which is just scratching the bloody surface because every one of them has additional sources that they're drawing off of. And you can decide for yourself just who's being really good on this and who is evading the material. A thing that pops up also, I was going to mention, relates to Sarfati and Tay and the Glee Club concept, which I'm putting in the main topic in relation to what's going on in this chapter, the origins of science. It's a routine name dropping that they bring up Isaac Newton and Kepler and Galileo, and it's perfectly legitimate to point out how devout religious they were. It was in a time when you could get into terrible trouble if you weren't devoutly religious, but they were genuinely so. Every evidence suggests that Galileo was certainly not an atheist. Newton, of course, was apparently a non-Trinitarian. He had a problem with the Trinity and kept very, very mum about that a little bit, and also believed in astrology, as did Kepler. Brilliant people at that cusp between the pre-scientific magical worldview and the development of the scientific worldview that's starting to leak in the early stages of Newton. But he was an oddball on a lot of things. Science and the whole formation of science is an issue that Rodney Stark version of it tunnel visions on a legitimate issue, which is that science developed in the Western world in a way that it didn't in China and other cultures that had written languages and proto-science and a whole bunch of things. Why is that? Was it just because they were Christian? Not really. Because if you look at the Byzantine world, just as Christian as anybody in London, they didn't go in that direction. That although there was elements of it in the Catholic world, large swaths of the Catholic cultures were not exactly jumping on the science bandwagon conceptually. So now we're focusing in on a thing which it's all the Protestants doing. Well, yeah, kind of, but it's more complicated than that. For example, the role that cultures that were not under the dominance of a single military power, like in Holland, where they were bouncing around partly sometimes under Spain and sometimes not. The very fact that you have such a dynamism between the Reformation Protestant cultures and the Catholic cultures mean there's a lot of tumult going on. And science is starting to develop, and empiricism is starting to develop in that practical aspect. And it's also starting to have a bit of a feedback with eventually scientific engineering, the development of technology, which is therefore got economic value, and it relates to the development of colonialism. So there's an economic factor that's playing a role here, which is related to segments of Western culture, whereas the Chinese, who were just as clever as anybody in Europe, had a lot of philosophical baggage and economic baggage that didn't really permit them to take the kinds of leaps. And for that matter, they had a far too dominant political culture that kind of ran all the show in a way that stifled growth, in a way that the much more diverse competitive environment of Europe didn't. So you can get a cartoon version of it in Rodney Stark's many, many, many books that he spewed out over the years, which appeals to the philosophy that you get at in the creationist venue. Intelligent designers play off exactly the same bit, but it is certainly obsessive and has been obsessive for a long time in the creationist movement to have the Glee Club of great Christian scientists of the past. Never mind that we're not living in the 17th century anymore. How many of the great Christian scientists of the past would have retained the kind of faith they did, or in the way they did, if they had been apprised of the information we have today, or even in the 19th century? Yeah, hard to tell. It's a good thing post-flood we humans can eat the meat of the now very limited creatures. Yes, well, there's an awful lot of that, again, Glee Club providentialism and exceptionalism, and there's a whole bunch of baggage that's going around in that. Needless to say, they don't think a heck of a lot about parasites and diseases, as well as the red in tooth and claw carnivory aspect. We're going to have a lot of stuff. In fact, in the appendices in the new book, there's going to be quite a discussion of the creationist evasions and goalpost moving on the issues of diseases and their evasions on when diseases are developing and what are the processes that do that. Their catch-all, literally, their catch-all explanation for that is it's due to the fall. Adam's sin. There you go. Explains everything. No, it explains everything. It doesn't actually explain a damn thing. And we'll be having tons of technical citations and all that. I've been dribbling little bits and pieces of it on the sideline in previous bits, but we'll have the whole full Monty in the new book. It's delicious, the amount of stuff you learn trying to source fact check creationists. But anybody that's been following my show for any number of years will all be aware of the fact that most of the things that you encounter are things that are not being referenced directly by the creationists. It's the stuff that you follow up on, like the technical papers that aren't being discussed in the Bell's spider piece. It's the follow-up research where you actually learn most of the things. And in the narrow niche of the source they're citing, they'll either be very selective about picking things that won't have too much evolutionary content to them. This also occurs over intelligent design land, though. They'll often waive. It's what I call the gee whiz syndrome. Ooh, wow, look at how amazingly complex science is. In the old days, that would have been natural theology, that term. I like to refer to it as gee whiz. Anyway, the process of putting all of that context together, which is how I do these shows, underscores just exactly why creationism can't ever go anywhere. Because again and again and again, it's a top-down theological enterprise that has to contort the data field to fit the preconceived dogma. And so the job of scholars and annoying farts like me is to look at that data field that they're assembling and watch, pull the lid off to show you the tricks they're pulling and why they're doing what they're doing. Now, the next chapter is on the origin of the development of thinking about dinosaurs. So it's all the older paleontology, Mantell, and all that back in the 19th century, 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It looks like what I've glanced through so far in the notes that we're still a long way from actually getting some technical literature. They devote 2 whole chapters to trying to disassemble the bird-dinosaur connection. And I'll be interested to see to what extent it's just replaying the same shtick. If you were playing a drinking game, it's a sucker bet to say, are they going to bring up Alan Fiducia? Of course they are. They can't. They'll never be able to forget it. But the thing that I'm going to be looking for, since they, from my initial scan of the book, the intriguing thing is, although they mention kinds and have a brief mention of baraminology, there's no list of the dinosaur kinds that I can see in the book. You'd think they could just have like a chart that would be, here are the dinosaur kinds, which probably would be dinosaur families. I'm going to be particularly focused on that. My favorite group is not so much the big theropods and sauropods. Those are fun to deal with too. For me, it's the protoceratopsids and ceratopsids, and going backwards from the protoceratopsids into the psittacosaurs, because it's just flat out biogeographical evolution part in there. You can look on my website, the old chapter on Dinomania. I went through a lot of this stuff years ago. It's not new. There, I was basically lambasting Duane Gish's 1995 book, Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No. And revealing how much technical information was known even then about the Asiatic psittacosaurs, which were little small bipedal critters that are the first to have that very distinctive predentary bone that is uniquely characteristic, a diagnostic feature. Did you see creationists who intentionally avoid specific kinds is trying to tamp down on Behrman's, or is there a schism? I think it's more laziness. First of all, an awful lot of creationists don't really pay any attention to Behrmanology except as an abstraction. Kent Hovind, for example, literally, if you bring it up with him, he really doesn't know anything about it. Probably because it's written in a little too technically a way, and his level of scholarship is really more website crap and copying stuff that he can get off of websites, plowing through technical literature. I can't recall offhand in his entire creationist career going back decades of him ever showing any really in-depth familiarity with any actual technical paper, creationist or regular scientific. He doesn't get that far. Obviously, intelligent design and old Earth creationists don't think about it at all. But grassroots creationists still think in terms, and Joel Duff has mentioned this, grassroots creationists still think in terms of species as kinds, which is just flat out wrong from a creationist point of view, as the upper echelon creationists make a point of pointing out. Answers in Genesis and all the rest will say, oh, no, they're not species. Kinds are somewhere up kind of in the family level, which is actually the traditional definition of a kind is a family of animals. But the problem with that, which is what gets the burr up Ken Ham's butt, is that if you take kinds as families, don't you have an awful lot of evolution going on in them? And why do you decide that we aren't in the hominid family or the primates? How do you draw the line? And so that's why they have to be very vague about it, because you can get the actual Behrmanologists like Todd Wood and Kavanaugh and all the rest, and they fall off the gangplank often, which is another thing that bothers the Ken Ham wing. Some creationists come in thinking I'm going to solve it, and then they read the room and realize that's not helpful. There may be elements to that. Certainly the reluctance of the professional creationists, Todd Wood and others who are in the Behrmanology movement, which Wood functionally created, Kurt Wise and others, back in the 1990s. So it's quite recent. It's functionally 21st century. 1999, I think, is when they had their first big Behrmanology conference. And effectively, they just took cladistic systematics and changed the names. So holotype becomes holobehrman, and so they're just simply following through monophyletic, phyletic. It would be monobehrmans that are lineages theoretically within another behrman. So a lot of it was just nomenclatural shuffleboarding. But getting down to the niggling little detail parts, I think the major part is that they have to leave out too much data. And it's fun sometimes watching them leave the data out. So Kurt Wise and others will just say, I'm not paying any attention to genetics. We discussed this in the previous book where we were going into about bats and that issue and the problems with Behrmanology's only dealing with two of the many families of bats and leaving out the fossils and the genetics. Well, surprise, surprise, they can find that they can get their Behrmans to look kind of plausible if you leave out enough data. And they're in terrible shape the moment they try to deal with any of these larger systematic groups to try. How do they draw the line? So you can practically see their brains starting to shut down at that level to where none of them really get to the point of being terribly rigorous about it, except to some extent people like Kavanaugh and Wise who will follow the logic of their ANOPA and various other techniques that they've come up with for analyzing the systematic data, the cladistic data points, which, by the way, they did not essentially contribute. Again, more secondary parasitism. where they come to conclusions that just cause conniption fits. I think it was I think it was Wood who decided that Australopithecus sediba is in the human holobarometer. You have to really stretch the context to think that you could have one of the Australopithecines in our genus, which effectively that's exactly what they're doing by pulling them into the same kind as human beings. And needless to say, this has not been popular outside of that little niche. And so it tends to get downplayed a lot. And so I think overall, as I pointed out in earlier episodes, you've got a tremendous reluctance to air the dirty linen of controversies in their field in public. So again, Kent Hovind is a perfectly fine measuring stick of what a grassroots bottom feeder thinks is creationism versus what the upper echelon people are. That either he was lying or an idiot when he was saying he'd never heard of the heat problem. I'd never heard about that before. Maybe not, because he pays so little attention to it. But you would have to have not investigated at any great level the little nooks and crannies of creationism, in the same way as there's a tiny little niche of data that was developed, and we're going to be discussing in the new book, on what the flood conditions were in terms of paleocurrents and water depth and other things that lead to just gobsmackingly implausible conditions for the poor ark to be surviving. And you can practically see people like Baumgartner's brain shut down, not following through on the logic of all the pieces that they have. So I think that the obvious point is that no creationist ever puts together all the pieces. And if they're ignoring the pieces of their own cartoon, let alone the vaster field of the actual science data, the kind of vacuous drivel that you get at the Sarfati level, who has credentials enough and an awareness of the fiddly bit parts that should justify them being much more rigorous and detailed than they actually are. So what's going on in their heads that causes them to do that? I think it's the Tortugan mindset at work. I don't think it's being usually tactically manipulative, although I've spotted instances of that. Over in the intelligent design movement, for example, Michael Denton is an atypical intelligent designer in that he kind of sort of is okay with common descent and kind of sort of okay with a lot of evolutionary speciation. He's exceedingly vague about it in all of the books he's ever written, so it's hard to pin him down. But in his extemporaneous discussion, I was at one of his little silly little books that he's come up with at the Discovery Institute. It's basically gee whiz stuff. And it was free and open to the public, and I went over because I wanted to hear what he had to say about it. But John West was hovering in the sidelines, ready to steer the conversation back to more acceptable intelligent design tropes, when some of the questions, some from me and other people in the audience, that was indicating that a lot of Denton's views on what he thinks was going on isn't all that congenial with the God did it, Jesus Christ is designer model that virtually everybody at the Discovery Institute believes, except him and David Berlinski, apparently. Do you think the characteristic laziness is no one wants to put in the work? Oh, a lot of these people are very diligent. I can't, if you look at the bulk of somebody like a Michael Denton or the volume of material that an Andrew Snelling puts out, you can see that they're perfectly capable of doing very elaborate writings. Although, to be fair, or to toot my own horn, this book, frankly, is not as extensive in terms of references or content than the books I've done. So it's got pretty pictures, but the content level is actually relatively superficial. Things like Steve Myers' 2 books, which are fairly thick mothers, 600 pages ish, but it only looks like you've got about 800 sources per book, and I don't know how much overlap there is between those 2 books, to where maybe he doesn't necessarily, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's got 1,600. Well, I have way more than that in Evolution Slam Dunk, and my data field in my main tip data field is at the moment 31,000 technical papers. So his entire reference bibliography is just little teeny thin veneer compared to the information that's actually out there. So I can't attribute it to laziness, and I think, good gravy, they're paid a ton of money for the people at the upper echelon. Of course, Ken Ham is not a scientist, but he pulls down about 150 grand. Steve Meyer is a philosopher with some scientific training. He pulls about that same amount. So there is an incentive to keep up the apologetics, even if they're not necessarily doing much in the way of genuine new work, even within their own framework. Now, you do have a few folk, Douglas Axe, and kind of, sort of, the bunch around Gunter Beckley, although I'm still waiting for that Bloody Whale paper to come out to see what the hell's going on in there. If you're a Tortugan mind, though, and you start looking at the dynamics of how that works, the fiddly bit meticulous, let's figure out all the data. Let's act like a vacuum, because now we want to use our fabulously well thought out model to chew up all the available science data to show that we can do it way better than those nasty materialist evolutionists. Well, you can see the problem in that logic train. They don't have a model. So they can't apply it in principle to acting like the great maw, chewing their way through the data field. Young Earth creationists have allegedly a model, the big slosh, but it's far too diverse amongst creationists as to when did the flood start, when did it stop, and how intense was it, and does it have accelerated radioactive decay or not, and I don't want to think about that heat problem, blah, 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 and whoop, and they start shutting things down on it or appeal to a miracle. And again and again and again, you're going to find that sort of thing happening. Greetings, Purple. So, but I'm a charitable sort and willing to not attribute laziness to them. Now, there are occasional instances, and I mentioned some last week about, and weeks before, about Andrew Snelling and his screwball crap that's popping up in the new book. That you'll see yet more examples. We mentioned Snelling and his evasions on diamond radiocarbon. And that trope continues to be repeated. So if you have a set of top-down dogmas and an apologetic literature that is satisfying to the believer, which is the sort of worldview that Gillis or Kent Hovind or Sarfati circulate in, it's effectively plugging the dike holes, or better yet, making sure that you're in an insular worldview. That's why this book is being written, the Titans book, is that they would like to have a nicely coherent, from the dogma point of view, set of apologetics that they can all rely on. Kids can be raised in it. They'll have pretty pictures, and it'll all be with the approved young Earth creationist spin. And so theoretically, children and people can operate in that little fantasy world. It's like going to a Disney resort. You know, everything is packaged to fit the corporate image. Well, in this case, it's the theological image. I think the sheer number of creationist venues means that they can try this trick much more effectively than the, by comparison, cottage industry of intelligent design, which is effectively the Discovery Institute and the various interconnections that they have made around the world. And it is around the world. They've got branches in Brazil and various other places, translations of the books in Poland, and there's a whole bunch of things like that. But it's small potatoes. Although, as we can see from this Bell bit, you find that intelligent design literature being parasitized when convenient by the creationist movement, which therefore saves them a bit of their own efforts. And in that respect, yeah, I think that an aspect of laziness can be an element there where they can go, oh, well, Michael Denton or Castle or something, oh, they've explained all of this beautifully. We don't need to. We can just refer you to them, and skips them from the need to actually build up an argument for themselves. So my viewpoint would be, from decades, as I was first starting to look into that when Young Earth Creationist was just kicking into high gear back in the 1980s, and then when the Discovery Institute brand of intelligent design started to percolate in the mid-1990s on, and the revolution that never came, as the Wedge document was expecting that by the early 2000s, there would have been this great scientific paradigm change towards their non-materialist viewpoint. Sorry, it didn't happen. And so rather than them attributing that failure to the product line being claptrap, like selling us a bunch of Edsels and Yugos, it's because somehow or other the nasty evolutionist materialists have this hegemony and a lock on the educational regimes in the colleges and all the rest. And it then can lead into a conspiratorial way of thinking. There's an aspect of this, it's a very genteel brand of conspiracy thinking, but it can also spill over into political extremism, or, as is in the case, not all creationists and intelligent designers are anti-vaxxers, but a chunk of them are. And so they're linking up with that network that circulates with anti-abortionism, which is an almost ubiquitous position amongst anti-evolutionists. It's part and parcel of their ideology. They're pretty much down on gay rights and trans issues, and you'll even find a few starting to riff off of the critics of those issues in the secular side. Jerry Coyne and others can get fed in there, and there's it's a fascinating bouillabaisse of interest groups that start networking that goes on there. And the creationists have been playing a part in that bouillabaisse for a very long time and very surreptitiously. So Tony Perkins and the Council on National Policy, he's a young earth creationist, Ken Hamite, thinks the Creation Museum is great science, and that Ken Ham is a great Bible scholar. His network of people interconnects with the broader field that includes Rick Santorum's intelligent design friendly point of view. There's been just a revolving door of people, and quite a lot of people staffing the Trump administration have come through that network. At no point are we getting any public discussion. Your average culture camp conservative is not making a big deal out of evolution, even though they are anti-evolutionists. It just doesn't show up. Although I would think if they were in power at enough levels long enough, they'd give it a whack. And one of the things that bothers me is the prospect that some creationist legislation at one of these state levels, Mississippi, Arkansas, there's a lot of different spots where this could occur, would be to try to reintroduce young earth creationist education and use it as a test case to get the Supreme Court to overturn Edwards v. Aguilar, which, by the way, Justice Scalia wrote a dissent of. I've alluded to this in previous episodes, and go to my website and you can read the discussion there in tip 1.6, where I went into an analysis of this. Edwards v. Aguilar is a decade after Roe v. Wade, so it would strike me that there's nothing intrinsically impossible about that being overturned if you had the right conditions on that. So we live in interesting little times, and the creationist worldview is having an effect even when politicians are not overtly mentioning evolution as an issue or making a thing out of it. It's their mindset that's so critical. The grassroots creationists care if the big shots like AIG disagree with them. It varies. I don't think somebody like Kent Hovind down in the bottom feeder level doesn't really bother much with waving the groups, and he riffs off of everything all over the place, like Harun Yahya, the Islamic creationist. He would be pulling off of that. Older material. There's the vast majority of stuff at the Kent Hovind level is just repetition of stuff he's been pulling out for years and years and years. The AIG and ICR bunch and CMI have differences of opinions on stuff, and they try to kind of downplay them, although it can get into hissy fit level, because I think Jason Lyle left the ICR because Gugliuzza, who's now head of the thing, has his vendetta against natural selection. So I think the extent to which they continue moving, we'll find out. They're as geriatric as I am, largely. And they've been worried for quite some time about the fact that there's not really a very vibrant young generation of people coming on the scene. So we'll find out how many of them just kind of atrophy as they start slamming into Gen Z, and whether or not they can gain many converts in that area. The excellent point there. Wouldn't be shocked if it happened in Florida when a year they just authorized use of PragerU kids material for second graders. Yeah. And PragerU would be the intelligent design branch of anti-evolutionism. They have made a point of fielding Steve Meyer's bunch. And it may give them, I think there's a certain collegiate pomposity about the intelligent design movement. They're people who are Cambridge and Oxford educated. They can sit on a dais with John Lennox, the British physicist, with complete calm and equanimity, and wave their little PhDs at everybody in a way that the wilder canons over in young earth creationism can't. On the other hand, there's way more creationist material out there in terms of even in terms of technical journals. There are pseudoscience technical journals, but young earth creationism has way more publications going on, vast. Whereas intelligent design's little bio-complexity has kind of gone moribund. And if you're not generating product and merely recycling kind of the same old shtick on the little pimple back ass, I don't know that that branch is going to be making much headway against Abeka and ACE, and also the various things that are put out that are they have a whole line. I wish if I'd had the money, I would have bought the little kids books that they had at the same venue that this was, but that was almost $40 to buy that Sarfati book. So what can you do? So PragerU is just a classic example of that culture camp, culture war, reclaiming America for Christ mentality that unites all branches of anti-evolutionism. And if it weren't for the conniption fits that Christian ideologues on the right would be having with cozying up too closely to Muslims, there's a culture camp attitude. Most of the attitudes of anti-evolutionist Muslims are entirely congenial. They don't like gay rights either. And if you're in the Taliban, you chop people's heads off. ISIS and all these other things, movements have that same extremism. So in a world in which there wasn't the polarization between Muslim terrorists and conservative ideologues fuming about Muslim terrorists, I think there would have been a natural movement to find common cause amongst the culture camp conservatives of the other flavor of not eating pork on the God of Abraham front that Islam represents. And Islam and Christianity together are most of the planet. Barely, but most. Taken separately, then it's Christianity is a big kid, but not the majority of the planet. And then a slightly smaller big kid of Islam, 2.6 million billion and 1.6 billion-ish for Christianity versus Islam. And together, then they add up to a little over half of the population of the planet, only if they come together. So politics and ideology and the whole threat of terrorism and the like, and the fact that you can't pretend that Islam is going to go along with the Trinity, has kept them from ever kind of coming too close together. So that normal alliance that might have been formed in another environment may never occur. It still won't mean that they can't be a tremendous nuisance. I think Saudi Arabia's school system still has problems with the earth revolving around the sun. Whereas ironically, Iran, so don't assume that all of the Islamic world is uniform. Iran teaches evolution in its schools. They just kept pretty much all the curriculum from the old Shah's era, and they haven't really altered that. Whether or not some of the ideologues and the mullahs would like to change it, I don't know. We'll see what's going on. They also have problems with women not wanting to wear hijabs. So away we go. So anyway, that goes on to quite a long range. Everybody, please use the word Kulturkampf and Tortuken and all those cute little buzzwords that I come up with, because I came up with them for a reason, because there were terms that needed to be done to clarify the circumstances of things. Culture camp means culture war, culture struggle, and comes from Bismarck's war with the Catholic Church over parochial education. It's a nice foreign word that sums up that culture war aspect and the critics of people. I think it's a nice term to apply to that. And it's not focused on the individual ideology per se, but to the targets that they're running against. They dislike the modern world and want to go back to an imaginary past and all that. And often they will fill in which version of the imaginary past they want to have. Tortuken is simply that turtle mind shell mind. That is, I think, the diagnostic feature of people who believe things that are really, 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 really not true. And that, too, is not content-based. It's cognitive method-based, source methods-based. That Tortukens can be liberal, they can be conservative, they can be religious, they can be atheist, they can be extremely brilliant or dull as a sack of hammers. Those are all not diagnostic features. But it does have the feature that they are easily addicted to secondary sources that they don't fact check. They have a top-down philosophy that they really want to be true, and they only pay attention to sources that reinforce that, which they don't fact check. They never really work out what they think happened, as we can see in terms of how creationism can't quite figure out whole butts of stuff about kinds and all the rest. And then the really powerful tool that keeps their mind insulated is their minds literally cannot conceptualize evidence they would accept to change their mind. And if you try to ask them about it, they'll be going through a little hopscotch of evasion and not actually addressing the thing, because their mind is pre-editing it for them long before it gets up to consciousness. And so it doesn't require them being consciously lazy or mendacious, although there can be examples of people that fall into that category. But you can have otherwise extremely brilliant people or even accomplished people in niches that nonetheless have a Tortuken rut that is dominating their thinking on that particular subject, and they'll be impenetrable in terms of trying to persuade them. And that's spilling over into politics and cultural issues in this polarization that makes it harder and harder for people to show common sentiments on things, even though there is an awful lot of common agreement, even spilling over into the culture camp world, as to decency and kindness and all that. All the bunch over there at that creationist church in Idaho would be people that you probably would have no trouble sharing a beer at a barbecue, and they would be decent and kind as all get out. And yet, regarding the science, they're believing absolute claptrap. So there we go. Pay all attention to that. We got just about an hour in here. I think, and we're still in swelter mode here in Spokane, although not nearly as icky as what's going on in Arizona and Texas and other places, where they also, and in Texas and other spots, when you're in the east, you've got that humidity problem as well. So it's warm, but we can manage it. At the moment, we're heading along pretty good, and some of the fires are dampening down. We're not getting quite so much from areas. There was down one from Snake River, but I haven't had any air quality problems up here from Spokane, so the wind must have been going in a different direction. Anyway, I'm always on the lookout to make sure no wooden penguins get into my house. We have our standards. And we'll see you all next week. Everybody stay safe. Keep on learning. Tell everybody about the show. If you haven't bought the books but can afford them, I think you'll enjoy the reads. Let everybody know about them. I can use the royalties, and they're good works. We're plugging away at it. And if you can afford to have a continuing thing, just helping out on the Patreon side, the links in every video will have all of that stuff, and you can make a decision as you can. All the patrons who I have got, I am very, very grateful for all the help that you have shown. So anyway, everybody stay safe, and we'll see you all next week, shutting down until next wee hours.